Hello and welcome to a new episode of Cabbie Conversations. I'm here joined by my friend James. Say hello.
Hello.
And today we're going to be talking about first and foremost, probably the realest, meatiest topic we've ever had on this program. It's birds. What is your favorite species of bird, James?
So if you had asked me when I was 4, I would have said the blue-footed booby because I thought it was just hysterical. And also I just loved that its feet were actually blue. I couldn't get over that. I thought that was amazing. Now I've kind of moved on, and there's this new bird that came out quite recently, a new subspecies of bird of paradise called the vogelkop, and it's basically got the male bird has these very dark black feathers, and when it's trying to engage the attention of a female to mate, it flips up its back feathers. These very black, they're like the darkest pigmentation known on Earth, so it absorbs loads of light, and it puffs up its bright blue chest feathers, and then dances around the female in like a little semicircle trying to serenade her, and it just looks really cool.
Isn't it the one that was on planet Earth? And then I think it was on planet Earth.
I think it was on planet Earth, yeah. I mean, David Attenborough seems to have a fondness for birds, which was why I suggested that we discuss species of birds.
I like penguins, even though they're really stupid. They basically move halfway across the Antarctic for no reason. But I respect that. And it just seems like they just deal with the most shit out of any bird. They like, you know, if they tap their egg the wrong way, it's just gonna just like freeze into a solid block.
And the fact that they're monogamous and they mate for life.
Yeah.
They co-parent. It's quite endearing, really, the penguin.
Yeah. They're not players like other birds. In fact, aren't most birds monogamous? I might be wrong in that.
I'm not sure. I don't think that's true, but a lot of birds are monogamous.
Albatrosses are. They're pretty sick.
I think the albatross is monogamous, and it takes a long time to raise an albatross. It takes definitely more than a year. It takes a couple of years to raise an albatross, so it's quite a commitment.
What is your opinion on the flightless birds? Do you think that they're hacks and they're posers, like emus and ostriches?
Well, you could throw penguins in there too. Penguins can't fly. Well, I think that ostriches, you know, they've just got really, really fast instead. So I think, you know, they're kind of winning.
They're pretty cool. They're the only birds you can like ride potentially.
I mean, I would not like to try that. I mean, if you wanted to say to me one day, would you like to ride an ostrich? I would definitely say after you.
Obviously, I would. Are you joking? Like, yeah.
I mean,
penguins aren't even birds, though, technically.
Well, they are birds.
No. They're technically mollusks. I looked it up.
I don't believe you. That's complete lies.
I want to use this podcast to spread misinformation. We should do that more. One thing that is true is that penguins have knees. They're all bent up in their fins.
Yeah, I mean, that's true, but you know, whales have hips.
Whales have feet bones. It's evidence of evolution.
Exactly. They're just really tiny and shrunken.
Like, don't use them anymore. Alright, well, that was bird talk. Stay tuned every episode. We're going to have a 30-minute long section where we talk about birds. And, you know, we talk about the main subject for like 5 minutes. And obviously I'll come to you at the end with your final thoughts about birds. So, the real topic, the real man topic is the prison system. Uh, you know, basically, do we think the prisons are good for preventing crime? Well, I guess the main question you have to ask yourself is, well, I say ask yourself, I'm going to ask you, James, is what do you think the main purpose of sending people to prison is?
Well, I don't think there's three main roles of the prison. The first and foremost, it's to protect the public from further harm. It's to punish the individual who committed the crime by depriving them of their liberty, and it is to rehabilitate the individual to come back into society, because most prisoners do.
Mm. It's interesting that you say that because I would actually disagree slightly. I would say the first
Okay.
and foremost reason for imprisoning people is that so you don't imprison people, by which I mean you deter people from committing crimes in the first place.
Okay. Yeah.
That's sort of the main reason for punishment in general. But essentially, and obviously, in order to have that deterrence, you need to actually lock people up because otherwise, there wouldn't be any deterrence at all. But
Full bark and no
realistically,
bite.
yeah, exactly. You need to, what you ideally want is for as few people in prison as possible. Uh, and it's interesting you say protect the public because I would say like about half the crimes you get sent to prison for aren't particularly in relation to harming like the public, at least not directly. Um, but I do agree, obviously, in principle, that is the uh, an important reason to send people to prison.
Yeah, you can't have the Ted Bundys, George Wests, and the Yorkshire Rippers of this world wandering around on the
None of
street.
them knocking about on the down your street. That'd be crazy.
It's just not. It's just not viable. But and like you said, a lot of the crimes that do occur aren't so much threats to the public. They're more like it's mostly theft and petty crime. That is the majority of crime that does occur. And often it's also important to think that most crime occurs in areas or in times of deprivation and poverty.
Mm.
It is the people who are in the most it is those people who live in the most deprived areas of society who are most likely to perform crimes. And the people who tend to be the victims of crimes are therefore also those in their immediate surroundings.
Absolutely. I think it's important to note that, I mean, it's kind of common knowledge at this point, but you really do have to think about this in the sense that the majority of people who are going to prison are from very unfortunate backgrounds, which might seem obvious, but when you really think about it, the system really just exists to perpetuate that. Again, it's sort of common knowledge that prisons are a breeding ground for criminals. Particularly in America, for example, almost every prison will have gangs that are often divided up into race. Like, you're basically turning people on the street and basically forcing them to become racists in order to survive. You know, because to deal with such a harsh environment, you sort of have to adapt to it. Whereas, you might have you might have been doing some petty crime before, but now you've become an actual hardened criminal that's never going to be properly rehabilitated.
I think that especially in young people, prisons definitely are a breeding ground for crime. But I found quite an interesting statistic that I think it's like 98% of crimes or something are committed by those under 39.
Mm-hmm.
So it's mostly young people who are interested in committing crimes, and especially it's young offenders in particular who then go on to reoffend and reoffend and reoffend.
Mhm.
Their crimes getting more and more serious because they're from an early age they're entered into basically a crime school, and they're basically grow up to believe the more time they spend in these institutions that the more time you spend, the harder you are, because the more respect you get, because that is how it works in prisons, but it's not necessarily how you spend it in the outside world. It's not necessarily the same view. So, and it's noticeable in areas where education is better, where youth offences and youth offence and crime rates are high. It's important to sort of try and integrate these children and young people into the positive mindset of education, educate them on drugs and alcohol, check their home lives for abuse, instead of necessarily punishing young people, because I don't think that young people necessarily will learn that way.
I think this is the main problem with it, in the sense that there's not so much problem with sending people to prison in principle, but like you say, a lot of people don't respond well to it. And the problem is we use prison as a sort of catch-all, with very few exceptions. It's basically what we use to punish every crime. Uh, you know, where in a lot of cases it's not really appropriate, and it only serves to enhance it. In particular with young people, like you say, sending them to prison is only ever going to make things worse, in my opinion. Because on top of what we've already mentioned, if you think about it like this, if you're told your whole life that you're never going to amount to anything, and then because of that you resort to doing petty crimes, being sent to prison is sort of a confirmation of that. And you're only going to be confirmed in your mind that you are destined to be in prison, or just basically be committing crime your whole life, and you're never really going to amount to anything. And the ideal way to solve this, obviously, would be to be encouraging for people and create projects. And this, to be fair, a lot of prisons are doing this nowadays, where they have projects, school lessons, ways to sort of better yourself, change your path in life while you're in prison. And that's obviously the point, to a lesser extent, it's the point of community service as well, is to give people that sense that they can give back to the community, and to see how good that feels, rather than resorting to crime. Because in my mind, committing crime is basically, well, maybe not for all crime, obviously, but in a way, especially for young people, it's a way of getting attention. And that's really all people want. Or to be accepted, perhaps, is a more accurate term. And it would be ideal if you could show people that you can be accepted by not committing crimes.
But gangs do provide a form of acceptance to people who say do not have a strong family structure.
Yeah, most people who... Sorry, go on.
I would say, though, that a leniency on prison sentences is not necessarily, though, a positive thing. Because often, say, if you have a repeating, say you have a burglar who repeatedly steals, and say, and say he gets locked up for 6 weeks, and he primarily targets elderly people. The elderly people won't report the crime because they know that he'll be out in 6 weeks or whatever. So there is no desire for them to report the crime, because he'll be back out in 6 weeks, and because he'll be out again in 6 weeks, he doesn't really care about reoffending, because 6 weeks isn't ultimately, he feels, a very long time. So
This is absolutely a good point, and in the justice system, you have to sort of. I'm talking about it obviously from mainly a perspective of prisoners, but you obviously have to examine it from the view of the victim of crimes,
uh,
and you have to
and
obviously go with anyone.
if say if this person, say if he repeatedly, and he say he's given a 3-month sentence, he's far more likely to then commit another crime. But if he's given, say, a 3-year sentence instead of a 3-month sentence, he's far less likely to recommit the crime or to continue with the crime. And I think that often a longer sentence and a longer period of a deprivation of liberty does cause people to reflect more. For example, in the UK, 47% of offenders reoffend within a year of leaving prison, but that decreases at the longer time you increase the sentence, because I guess, I mean, I think we're feeling this in lockdowns, which are sort of our own house arrests. The desire to kind of repeat these, I guess, these nihilistic behaviors that we were expressing are less and less desirable.
No, that's true. That's a fair point. You need to obviously have some. Again, the point of prison should give you time to reflect and to make you think that, oh, I don't want to be here for the rest of my life. And to do that, you sort of need to spend a decent amount of time there, obviously. I just think that there are other ways of sort of going about that. To give you an example, like the example you're talking about, if there was to say a repeat offender, I feel like the first time you incarcerate someone like that, that's your real chance to change their outlook. And obviously it depends on the kind of person, but I think a lot of people would respond, well, maybe some people would respond to, harsh treatment, and they'll be like, well, I don't want to go back here because it's shit. But I think a lot of people would respond better to being given other opportunities and being shown like that there's other paths you can take, basically. And this is the classic, obviously, rhetoric that politicians like to use is, oh, but you're being soft on crime, and like, I'm going to bring back law and order and create these huge lengthy sentences, because while in principle I agree that you need a certain amount of time is needed to give you actual perspective. Like, you're right, you're spending like 6 weeks in prison is nothing. It's either you or I could probably do that. We're not exactly made for that environment. But spending a year or so in prison is a significant amount of time. It's a year of your life you're never going to get back, and that will probably give you a lot of time to reflect. But these sentences nowadays, particularly in America, not so much in Britain. We're still fairly, I would say, lenient in a good way. In America, though, you have absolutely astronomical sentences, because the rhetoric of politicians is to increase sentences because that's what the public wants. Like you say, and it's not like there's no merit to this either, because, like you say, a victim of a crime would want to know that their perpetrator is going to go away to prison for a decent amount of time and get, they're going to get justice, basically. But the problem is just putting people in prison, whether they're criminals or not, having such a huge amount of your population in prison, to me, just makes no sense. It's like sweeping the dust under the rug. It's like the most bare bones, ineffective, inhumane way of dealing with society's core problems, is to just basically push everyone into prison that you don't agree with.
I mean, I agree. I don't think just because I say I'm for a harsher sentence, it doesn't mean I'm not, say, for restorative justice, where, say, the victim and the perpetrator of the crime meet and discuss how the crime has affected them. And I'm not against. I'm very for education, or like education in criminals, and I'm also very for most prisoners. So in prisons, people who are in prisons are 3 times more likely than the general population to have a mental health condition, personality disorder, something like that. So these people are vulnerable to not having a thought process which would lead to maybe a non-violent outcome, or being able to make decisions that would not lead to a crime. These people are at greater risk to that than, say, the general population. So I'm all for rehabilitating but it's interesting. So in Norway, for example, they take a very they have a quite an interest. They treat criminals very differently to how we would say in America, with like America when we think of shackles and solitary confinement and harsh sentences and death row. The Norwegians promote very much a social reintegration of a criminal into society. The prison population is allowed to vote in Norway, for example. The prison population can see their families. They can and they're like they're what's it? They're encouraged to be responsible, have employment, things like that, but they are still arrested. But the problem is with case is that a lot of this more, you could say, gentle approach could be that they still didn't solve the problem. For instance, they have 55% more violent crime in Norway with this more gentle approach still than Ireland, which does not take the same view towards crime. So although this encouragement for a more human response, and I do believe that prisoners do deserve to be treated with respect, but I do feel that too much leniency will not stop them from committing these crimes. I mean, for example, I guess quite an infamous case is Jeffrey Epstein. He was under house arrest for his links to being in a paedophile ring. He was on house arrest, but he could still go to work during the day. He could and then return to his police cell. But like, because he was doing that, he was still able to access and commit lots and lots of crime, and like endanger lots of people because he was given too much liberty. To me, that's not a proper sentencing for the crimes he committed.
I absolutely agree. And when I say I want to be more encouraging and humane, I don't mean, I actually disagree with that, the Norway and sort of approach, in that you basically make prison quite comfy, but don't really offer any way of, there are obviously like rehabilitation programs similar to there are in the UK, but they basically just make prison life pretty comfy, and that's not really what I'm talking about. I do think, like, for example, something as simple as like sharing a cellmate is quite an ordeal. Like just not having your own space, I think that's a good idea, because that, sort of, it's a way of sort of subtly punishing people without, obviously depriving them of their human rights or anything.
I mean, yes,
it has a bigger impact than you might think. Like, even if you like your cellie, it doesn't mean you want to spend every minute with them. But the real takeaway for me is like, yeah, just giving opportunities for them to change their behavior. Because I'm of the opinion that essentially anybody can change for the better if you give them good enough direction. Maybe I'm wrong, and it's probably not true for everybody. Certainly not the Ted Bundy types or whatever. But I'd say that, well, to give you an example, I was trying to look it up, but I couldn't find it. But there's a podcast called Ear Hustle, where they basically talk to prisoners who are in prison still. Well, this was an exception, but essentially there was a story of years and years and years ago, this cop was chasing this guy, and cut a long story short, the guy got the upper hand and basically beat the cop really savagely. Tried to kill him. He was like openly like, yeah, I tried to kill him, but he didn't. Obviously, luckily, he didn't manage to. And he got sent to prison. Years and years and years later, there was an opportunity basically for parole. And initially, obviously, the cop who survived didn't want him to. But they had this program where basically the victims of crimes could meet with their perpetrators. And they did that, and they said that immediately after meeting, they became pretty much friends, which is absurd to hear about. But like, to go from actively wanting to kill somebody to them forgiving you and like, you saying, "Oh, look, I'm really sorry," like genuinely sorry. I don't know. To me, that's the end goal here. It's to reunite people with, like, to get people to change is you have to show them kindness to some extent. And it's a two-way street, You have to the person, the perpetrator has to admit guilt, and they have to work and repay to a certain extent what they've done, be it with time in prison or something else. But after that, like, yeah, I think that's the end goal.
I do think that restorative justice is a very valuable way of getting criminals to change and victims to kind of change their opinion on, for victims to come to peace to what happened to them, and for criminals to come to terms with what they do has a negative impact on others' lives. I think that's very important. And I think the problem is a lot of prisons, like I said, with these prisoners, not only are they deprived of liberty, but they're also deprived of opportunities to change their behaviour. Often, like I said, prisoners are uneducated, so they don't have the education, they don't have the necessary skills to, say, maybe find a trade or a profession outside of crime. This is especially the case in, less developed countries, where they're locked in a cage and the key is thrown away, and then they're finally chucked out onto the street with, maybe like $20 or something, if that. That is not going to set somebody up for a positive restart in society. But I think it's even noticeable in the UK. Prisoners are being locked up for longer periods of time by themselves, and things like that. Complete isolation for, say, 23 hours a day, not being able to move, not being able to, just wasting their time in there is not going to, those sort of things are not helpful ways of helping people. And I do think prisons need to be better equipped to deal with the restorative side of justice. But at the same time, I do think that I don't think that sentences should be lenient, because I feel like people won't change their behaviour unless a lot of time has elapsed and a lot of time for reflection has occurred.
The reality is, unfortunately, that we can sit here and talk about this, but in a way it's already too late. You hear so many stories about people who go to prison for such lengthy amounts of time, and again, I'm not disagreeing with your point, because I think that's obviously necessary, but the problem is, so many of them are like dads and mums, so they go to prison and for like 15 years, say. The kid's like 5 when they go. Then he's going to be like 20 by the time he gets out. And there's so many, almost every time, like, you hear stories about this stuff, the dad or the mom is always like, please don't make the same mistake as me, you know. They want to give their kid a better life, and they've really learned their lesson. But by that point, it's too late, because the kid subconsciously has put it into their head that it's like, you know, well, they just haven't had that parental figure in their life, so they're gonna basically go down the same path as parent. So in a roundabout way, what I'm basically trying to say is that the prison system is obviously a necessity, but it's very much been used as I guess Americans would say, band-aid solution to society's real problems, which is obviously extreme poverty and just general, you know, the need to survive, fit in, be cool. Like, these aren't good. The prison isn't going to solve these problems. It will. I think it can do on an individual basis. You can make people really change their outlook, and some people, you know, some people really do need that. I think a lot of people, whether they've committed crimes or not, could benefit a lot from being sent to prison, like, to really sort their attitude out. But again, it's not just what you do to the individual. It's you're then affecting other people by doing that. And also, yeah, just to go back, like, the other problem is, I suppose the assumption is, you know, you watch these prison films and whatever, and the guy gets out at the end, and it's all like, you know, sunset and nice, and it's all optimistic and stuff. And then obviously, like, if you're in prison, all you're looking forward to is getting out. But for a lot of crimes, in fact, for pretty much every crime that you get sent to prison for, getting out isn't really the end, because, you know, you're trying to get a job almost anywhere, and they'll ask, have you been to prison? Even something as simple as working in a supermarket, like, they'll ask you if you've been to prison, and you can't lie about it. It really does stain your reputation for your whole life. I think that's the biggest punishment, and that's the biggest thing that pushes people back into the cycle of crime, because they realize they really don't have much of an alternative. Luckily, there are more employers nowadays which are a bit more open-minded, and you'll always get, this isn't a stereotype to say, but you'll always get occupations like cleaners, basically low-paying manual labor jobs. They will always be more welcoming of prisoners, simply because they know that they can pay them less, and that, you know, basically nowhere else will take them, and not many other people want them. So that's the unfortunate thing you have to think about as well. But obviously, you know, on the flip side, one last thing is that if you're an employer, I do think you have the right to know if your employee has been to prison, depending on the crime, of course. If it's a violent
Agreed.
crime.
If say, I mean, you'll probably have perhaps do this, but in the UK we have something called a criminal disbarring certificate, and if you want to do anything in capacity that works with vulnerable people, you have to have one. So whether it's a teacher, you have to have one. A nurse, you have to have one. A volunteer in hospital, you have to have one. If you working with children, you have to have one. Working in a care home, you have to have one. And this does limit criminals from working in these areas. And also, I suspect if you went to prison for fraud or something like that, it would limit your ability to work it. You can't work at banks, and you can't work in the financial district either. So this does blemish your career projection, but that's also, I guess, an important deterrent of crime. It shows that there are consequences for your actions. And yes, and that's part of the reason why. And yes, I do think people can reform. But if you don't have these deterrents there, or these consequences to crime, then it would allow people to continue to reoffend as well.
The problem is with deterrence, as much as I was talking it up earlier, is that, as we said, a lot of crimes are committed by young people. Now, as a man of science, I'm sure you'll know that the brain isn't really formulated properly until you're, at least not fully developed until you're about 25. Which essentially means, well, you know, everyone can relate to this. Basically, you know, if when you're younger, you're a teenager in particular, you can make very rash decisions, things that you would never make when you're older, and that's why a lot of older people, in my opinion, as far as I understand, I think that's why less older people commit crimes. But when you're younger, you basically have less of a understanding of what your future is going to be like, so you therefore don't think about it as much. Basically, what I'm trying to say is, it's all well and good to say, you know, the fact that a crime will follow you for the rest of your life is a quite good deterrent when you understand that fact. And I'm not trying to be too lenient or, like, you know, whatever, but the reality is that a lot of young people don't understand that. And it's sort of defeating the point by punishing them so far after the actual crime has taken place, when they've already served their time. You know, in a way, I would almost rather sentences be longer, but this whole post-prison, you know, this whole thing is just not a thing, because then once you serve your time, you've actually served your time. I don't know how you think about that.
I do agree that young people are vulnerable to committing crimes, and they're not fully aware of the consequences that has in their future. But therefore, I think it's important for the state to invest in deprived areas, to invest in education, to invest in extracurricular, to provide extra support for these vulnerable children, to prevent them getting interested in gangs, and to also educate children in grooming, because often these children are groomed into crime. It's not just it's not that they're instantly given a knife and told to stab someone or something, or they're instantly given a big bag of drugs and told to go and sell it or whatever. They're groomed in. They're initially given things like say if they might not have a phone, they're given a new phone. They're given clothes that their parents can't afford to give them. They're given maybe even something as simple as food or money to help pay the bills at home. And then suddenly, and that entitles a child to come back. And I think if children are educated on the potential of being groomed and what that might look like, they're less likely to make these decisions. And if they have a key interest, be it in sport or music or something creative, they're not going to be. They'll be busy engaged in, something that has a positive outcome for them, instead of being drawn to these groomers who encourage them to commit these crimes later on.
No, you're absolutely right. I think this is the bottom line, where the real solution to all of this, and it's been proven on multiple occasions, that education is the real solution. If you have an educated public, then you will have far less people committing crimes, just because they'll have more career prospects, they'll understand the world better, they'll understand, like you say, if you're being groomed. It's a slight side note, but it sort of ties back into the whole idea of sentencing. Like, James, for example, if I were to ask you what do you think, how long do you think you'd go to prison for if you went out and stole a car right now? How long do you think you'd get?
If I stole a car, I'd say I'd probably get maybe a year, 2 years max.
Yeah, but I'm sure everyone would have a different answer for that. And the problem is, I mean, especially when you think of like, life sentences. I think a lot of people wouldn't know, I don't think, that a life sentence isn't actually a life sentence. It's about
It's like
50
20
years
years,
usually.
25 years.
Yeah. In the UK, it's about 15 minimum, I think. But my point is, having longer sentences only really doesn't act as a good deterrent because you don't know. The average public doesn't know. I did law, and I still don't know all the sentences for all the crimes out there. You know, so in particular, the kind of people that will be committing crimes, I'm almost certain they won't know, and I really don't think that they definitely won't know that when they commit the crime that it's basically going to follow them for the rest of their life. So, yeah.
I disagree. I think it
No?
depends. If it's organized crime where they have lots of people coming, if it's part of a gang or something where they have lots of people coming in and out for certain things, it will be calculated. There'll be a risk calculated for the amount of time an individual in that gang will spend in prison relative to the cost of them committing an offence. I think also with in-prison gangs and stuff, things like drugs, because the drug market is huge in prisons. There's a massive drug problem in prisons. That sending people into prison to do the drugs or mobile phones is hugely desirable because the drugs being shared about in prison feed a lot of the drug movement in the UK and the profitability of drugs. So I think that they'll have a pretty shrewd understanding, these organized criminals, on the cost benefit of time in prison.
Certainly, the more veteran members of the gang, but like we were saying, I do think that a lot of people who are sort of just loose novices or whatever, members of the gang, will not have that understanding. And obviously, there are lots of other kinds of people who commit crime as well, not just people in gangs.
But of course there are. But I think that those individuals, even if they're quite low in the ranks of crime, if they're part of a gang, they will be briefed on what they want the individual to do in prison. They might be briefed for something to do in prison, whether it be to deliver a phone or whatever. There will be an understanding of what they are to do.
Well, you're talking about people like pretty much intentionally going to prison.
Some are intentionally going to prison, but some might be, caught for something and then also being told while in prison to do something.
No, that's very true. But I do think there are a large number of people. Well, for example, I've spoken to loads of people who think that essentially, if you kill someone by accident, you can not go to prison because it's like, diminished responsibility or whatever. And I think in general, because the rules keep changing and because they're not really in the public eye, it's hard to gauge. But I suppose, again, even if you did know, until you actually do the time, the difference between something like 5 years and 15 in prison can seem sort of not really all that different. You might think that once you're in there for over a year, it's basically irrelevant at that point because you're losing such a big chunk of your life anyway that you might as well consider it your new home. But ultimately, like we say, education is the biggest counter to all of this. And I would just like to say I would recommend that Ear Hustle podcast because while it makes no attempts to excuse the behavior that people do, because this is the thing, as much as I've been sort of a hippie you know, preaching peace and love and all that stuff. The way I see it, the way you live your life, there's sort of two conflicting things, where I think your environment shapes a lot of your behavior, but ultimately we are agents of our own free will, and you're making choices constantly. And to say that you have no agency whatsoever in the decisions you make is very naive. You always have a choice, and if you're I suppose this is advice to anyone out there who's thinking about crime. You always have a choice. You never have to take the easy route. You never have to take that route if it's not what you want to do. And so, yeah, you know, don't make excuses for yourself. Is basically what I'm trying to say.
No, I wouldn't. You are responsible for your actions, and you should be held accountable for them.
Absolutely.
But I do
But
think
you know,
that.
go on.
But yes, support is. I think the public actually needs to be made more aware of. I guess what happens, if, you know. I think that's why people have such a fascination in police, like, you know,
Police crime dramas. Yeah.
police crime dramas, and even just police crime document. You know, like what's it, 24 Hours in Police or something. Just following policemen, like arresting people and stuff. People love that stuff.
Yeah.
It's
very much it's very much an us and them type. This is the thing that I have the biggest problem with. I can understand completely with people who can't sympathize with criminals because, you know, they're portrayed in such a horrendous way. But you have to come to terms with the fact that while you may detest them and say, well, I'm better than them and whatever, the ultimate fact is that they're still human beings, and to dehumanize them is just sort of a fallacy. I mean, how many things have you done? How many things have you done in your life that you just look back on and say, "Oh, I really wish I hadn't done it." You know, and obviously it won't always be the same as like committing a crime. But my point is, people make mistakes like all the time, and while they should obviously be held accountable for that, if anything, making those mistakes makes them more human, not less. They made the wrong choices here and there, but maybe they can actually turn things around. Again, that podcast does a good job of that because it interviews people, and that, you know, you sort of start to realize that they're actual human beings with opinions and stuff like that. As absurd as it is to say, because I'm sure most people understand that, but you know, you have to remind people every now and again, especially when you hear about people talking about the death penalty and stuff like that. But that's probably a discussion for another day.
I think that is.
But yeah, any final thoughts?
No, other than I think sentences should be harsh in order to disincentivize it, first of all, to allow people to properly reflect on the actions they've done. But I also don't, although there is a problem with prison funding and stuff, people don't like to fund prisons because they want them to suffer. I do think that education and restorative justice are really important in allowing prisoners to come to terms with their actions, and that is an important part of there's something that prisoners and states need to be aware of if they want to improve the levels of crime, and that prevention is more important. That prevention is always better than cure. So always
exactly.
They should
that's a medical and a societal important methodology. You know, the ultimate aim should be stopping people going to prison in the first place. But yeah, thank you very much for listening. Tell us your opinions on your thoughts, if you agree or disagree, in the comments. And yeah, thanks very much for listening. Goodbye.